Is LBC News, 27 minutes after 2. Let's talk more about the potential for a national lockdown now here on LBC News. Boris Johnson urging people who are planning on forming a Christmas bubble with other households to start minimising social contact from today. He's not ruling out a third national lockdown after Christmas. Let's talk more about this now here on LBC News with the former Secretary of State for Tony Blair, Lord David Triesman. A very good afternoon to you, Lord David.
Good afternoon.
Thanks for joining us here on LBC News. So the messaging from the government at the moment is very much to take personal responsibility over the festive period. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think I've seldom seen more confused messaging in all the years that I've been involved. Of course, everybody should take personal responsibility. I think that's absolutely right. But the variety of messages about how many people, how close you can be, whether you can have other people in your households and then suddenly no other people in your households, the arrangements which seem to be being made now for schools. I think that people are at sea looking at all of these things and trying to figure out what really affects them and what they should do. We need much clearer messages than this.
Absolutely. And just talking about what might happen in the new year, in 2021, the government obviously not ruling out a third national lockdown in the new year. We know meetings will be going on at the moment, and the government will be having discussions with experts and their advisors. Why is it they're not telling us now? Why is it they're waiting until the new year, when all the data that we're being shown shows that the likelihood is that we're going to be in a third national lockdown?
Well, I think we'll be in a third national lockdown. I don't say that with any pleasure. I don't want to be locked down any more than anybody else does. But I think that it doesn't take a lot of reading of what Chris Whitty, the Chief Medical Officer, and others have said to recognise that the rates of infection are very, very sharp. And if people are all together, probably in closed spaces because of the time of year over Christmas, it's very likely that there will be a third lockdown. Now, I think what we're finding is that the politicians don't want to be thought of as being Grinch. They don't want to be thought of as making people's Christmas more miserable than it needs to be. And so they're playing around in a way with the sorts of advice that they give. You know, enjoy yourself, have a good time, but don't get close to other people. There are periods you aren't locked down. There are periods when you are locked down. There's different arrangements which change almost from hour to hour in different localities. And I just really would rather that we said, in the most serious way, it is a great pity, but let's follow what the Chief Medical Officer and others are saying. This will lead to a third spike, and a third spike, given the death rates we're already seeing, would be a very, very serious matter for the UK, for its economy, but also for people. I mean, 532 fellow citizens lost their lives yesterday. That's extraordinary, you know, and day after day we're seeing numbers going up now beyond 66,000, and I just think there's a point at which people are much, much more mature than the government allows for. There will be some people who will take unnecessary risks. I know that, of course, and they shouldn't. They most certainly shouldn't. But what I also know is that people will be mature and will respect advice which is likely to keep them and their older relations alive.
Well, you sat in on Cobra during the bird flu pandemic. What will be going on at the highest levels of government as they look at the data that's coming in and they look at the festive period and they look at what's going to happen next year?
Well, certainly in that period, we were very tough with ourselves. We took the view that the key thing was to make sure that people didn't get an infection with a disease which we had no real knowledge of, had no real way of curing. So we took steps which some people thought were draconian about travel, about movement around the world, and we had steps in place which would have closed down a great many things. And sadly, because a pandemic is a very serious matter, we began to make plans for what would happen if we experienced very significant numbers of deaths, talking to the religious communities and so on. All the preparations were there. And I think that although it was very difficult, I don't think anybody would ever say that the messaging was confused. They may have said it was hard. They may have said they didn't much like it, but it certainly wasn't confused.
And that is the real issue at the moment about confusion and people having to make their own decisions about what the rules say and how to interpret them as well. What are your thoughts on the tier system that we're currently in at the moment? It looks as though the tier system not working. Just looking at the data, that's, the most recent data, the R number going up. Tier 2, for example, just the data doesn't show that it's hard enough.
Well, I think that you've hit the nail on the head. I don't think it's hard enough, and we live in a country where there's essentially no internal borders. We don't stop people moving around, and of course people want to have a degree of freedom in all circumstances. But the result is that particularly this slightly variant form of the virus appears to be more infectious or more easily infects people, looking at the data. And so we're seeing rapid movements of people. We're seeing people getting together, even not at very, very close proximity, and the spread of the virus, the spread of the infection. And the other thing which I think is very significant in this is that, it's a matter which you and I have discussed before. The reality is that the vaccine will take a while to come along. We haven't really even got production facilities in this country, so we've got to hope that after the 1st of January we can move things around effectively. That's not so clear either. But we don't seem to be investing in the medicines that would stop people from dying. Now, until the vaccine is really effective and there's a community immunity, sorry, it's not intended to sound like it was rhyming language, but until we get to that point, we've also got a responsibility to stop people dying. I mean, I mentioned a drug I was trying to get into the UK because of its effect elsewhere in Cuba. In Havana yesterday, there were no deaths. There's been one death, I think, since the 1st of December. Here we had in England, I choose a country, England specifically rather than the UK because it's the same size as Cuba in geography, not the same size in population, but the same size in geography. We had 438 people die. Now, we need to address all these things. We need to get the vaccine there. We need to make sure that people don't move around and recklessly infect other people. And we need to be absolutely certain that we've got everything available to us to try to treat the people who do catch the disease.
Because we are in a better position than we were before we went into the first lockdown, because we know more about COVID-19 than we did back in March.
No, you're 100% right. It was a completely unknown disease. It's still pretty mysterious. Things like long COVID are not well understood, and we think that about a quarter to a third of the people who get COVID get long COVID. So there's lots to learn still, but there are a number of things which have improved. I think the medications have improved, but in my view, as I've said, not enough and not fast enough. That's really important, that we are not reckless with medicines, but that we move as rapidly as we can to get the right medicines in. And also the ways in which people are treated when they're in hospital. I mean, the practice of the nursing and the clinicians as staff. We know, that it's probably better if people are lying on their front than on their back if they're being ventilated and so on. There's a lot that's been learned. But goodness me, however fast we're learning, we better keep on learning very fast.
Yeah, absolutely. And just finally, talking about the government strategy, just to go back to that, what would you be advising the government to say in terms of their strategy in the run-up to the festive period when we're going to relax these rules for 5 days? I mean, there's no way we would be relaxing them looking at the data if it wasn't for Christmas.
No, I'm quite sure we wouldn't be relaxing them, and that's my point about nobody wanting to be called Grinch. The fact is that everybody says Christmas is very special. We've had a very hard year. People want to be together with their families, and of course they do. I'm no different. I want to be together with my family, but there are times when you have to say the threat is so great that we need to be mature enough to say perhaps we cannot have that degree of freedom even over Christmas. And I think we're grown-ups. This country is full of people who are grown up about these things. And I think that they would be very, very upset that it happened, but they'd understand it and they'd abide by those rules. If the alternative is a third spike in January, which now looks, beginning of February perhaps, which now looks increasingly likely, but you've lost your grandparents, I don't think that that's an equation that most people come down on the wrong side of.
And what will you be doing at Christmas?
I will be just with my wife and my daughter. We're fortunately in the countryside at the moment, which is unusual for us. We've been here now for a couple of months, and we will have a good party among ourselves. But I can guarantee that we will not infect any of our neighbours, and they won't infect us because they will take the same view. And I hope that everybody has a great Christmas and they all stay safe. I pray that they do, and you. By the way, I don't suppose anybody ever makes the point to you, but I hope you stay safe and well as well.
Well, that's very kind of you. Thank you very much for joining us here on LBC News, and do hope you have a safe and Merry Christmas. Lord David Triesman there, former Secretary of State for Tony Blair, and also sat on Cobra during the bird flu pandemic, also an epidemiologist as well, so man of many talents. Thanks very much for joining us here on LBC News. Just coming up to 22 minutes to 3, we'll have the headlines for you next.
This is LBC News.